Oh.
Raise your hand if that. Raise your hand if that was your dog. All right, we'll get started. People will still be joining us, so I'll just sort of do some preliminary things initially. My name is Gregory Luce. I'm the president of Adoptees United, Inc., which is a national nonprofit organization that's committed to equality, citizenship, and identity issues for adult adopted people. And I'm also an attorney with Adoptee Rights Law Center. And I think we have a few of our board members here tonight. Shout out to Annette. Hey, Annette.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
And then I think I saw Chelsea. Chelsea, you there? There you are. Hey,
Yep,
Chelsea.
I'm here.
Anyone else from the board? I just want to make sure.
I've not seen anybody.
They'll probably, they usually come. And then I also want to thank those who donated. You sort of pitch in a little bit towards the cost of putting these on. That really helps us do not only this one, but others in the future. Because we do, what you should know though, is we do pay a stipend or honorarium to our speakers. And so that typically goes towards paying them, because we think that it's we should pay them for their time. We'll get started pretty quickly. We're going to I want to talk about what I'll give you an overview of what we're going to talk about. I'll give you a general overview of annulments in the past, and I can put in the link to a video I made just recently that goes over essentially the history of annulments in the United States. And the history is really about annulling an adoption from the perspective of adoptive parents. They had a right in many states to annul adoptions, and for various reasons. Sometimes it would take good cause. Sometimes, back in the day, although these laws were on the books for many, many years, they could annul an adoption if the child was considered defective, essentially. Typically the things that they were always looking for were epilepsy, insanity, venereal infection, and then this sort of catch-all called feeble-mindedness, which was a eugenics term for essentially it caught anyone who really was not up to snuff as to what they thought a person should be in many respects. And so that history existed in the U.S. for many years, but those statutes sort of went away. They started to go away in the 1970s, but they still exist in some states. So in California, for instance, an adoptive parent can annul an adoption if the child has mental illness, and they did not know about that mental illness. And the other factor there is that they have to show that the child would have been unadoptable or not adopted at the time. But that's a current law in California. Kentucky has one that's race and ethnicity based, so that if your child that you adopted turns out not to be the perceived race or ethnicity that you thought it should be or would be, you have a right to annul in Kentucky if you didn't know about that at the time you adopted.
Fantastic gift for you.
As always, if there's fraud in adoption, that has often been a case where you could annul an adoption. Again, the fraud is what the adoptive parents allege. And if they can prove that there is fraud, that they may be able to annul it. It's very, very difficult to prove fraud. I know of one case in the U.S. in which that has occurred. And I'll get to introducing our guest in a second. And then I'll switch real quick to the screen share, and I'm just going to go through a few slides so you get a better idea of adoption annulment from the perspective of adoptees, because we're not making that up. It is something that has existed in the past, and something that we're considering pursuing in the present. So let me switch screens real quick. So hopefully you can see the screen, and this is the basically the question we're asking, and we're going to have a conversation today with Nikki Carlson. She's an adult adoptee, born in California and adopted in Minnesota, and I actually represented her in vacating her adoption, and she'll talk about how hard that was. Very hard, very difficult for me as well as the attorney, but her both emotionally and financially. And then I'll talk also to Claudia Corrigan Darcy and her son Max Corrigan, or G-Man, and talk about her biological son, and talk about their considerations of readoption, or essentially adopting him back. And we'll hear from both of them about that. But the question we're really talking about, the conversation we're having, is should there be a right to annul your own adoption? And one thing I always think we need to remember always, and it's not always really taken, this obligation is not always centered, is that in every adoption, including when you're trying to challenge an adoption, it's the question is always, the paramount consideration is the best interest of the child, or if you're an adult, you're the best interest of the adoptee. There have been annulments of adoption, or annulment statutes of adoption in the past that allowed an adopted person as an adult to, in Vermont and in West Virginia, sign, seal, and acknowledge before the judge of the probate court a dissent from such adoption. And that's why we're calling this program I Dissent. If you dissented, the court can issue an order vacating the adoption. So there was one in Vermont for many years, and one in West Virginia for many years. And so within 1 year after becoming of age, an adoptee, and so that's 18, sign, seal, and acknowledge a dissent from such adoption. And upon filing of the same, the adoption shall be void. That was the law in West Virginia for almost 100 years. It started in 1882, and it, I think they repealed it in the 1960s. What's interesting is that West Virginia legislators have reintroduced legislation more recently, in last 2 years ago, which would allow annulment of an adoption by an adoptee. So it's a tradition I think they've had, and I haven't talked to the legislators in West Virginia, but I'm going to determine why they're pursuing this and who's driving it. It's a little different than just signing and sealing and acknowledging that you want, you dissent from the adoption. This is, you have to go before the court and petition the court for annulling it. But there's no real standards that are listed in this statute. And so it's unknown how that would actually occur. And so this is the essentially the main clause of the bill, that any adult resident who has been previously adopted by order of a West Virginia court may petition a circuit court for court order annulling the adoption. So should there be a right to annulling adoption? Yes, I believe there should be. I think there's, it makes complete sense, especially because, and we'll talk to Claudia and Max about this, you as an adoptee, or anyone, can be adopted by another adult for any reason, really, as long as both people consent to it. So this has been done in the past with when same-sex marriages were not legal. People would establish a legal relationship with their partner through adoption. Inheritance is often a valid reason to adopt an adult, so you have an heir, and that was what adoption was all about back in 2,000 years ago in Rome. Or you could have an adult adoption for any reason. And there's adult adoption statutes across the country, and most states allow it. They may have some restrictions depending upon the age of the people who are being adopted. There has to be a gap of 10 to 15 years between the adoptee and the adopter. But this is essentially what we're talking about when we talk about readoption, that the majority of states would allow it with the consent of both parties. So I'll stop there. That's sort of this sort of background. I urge you to watch that video that we posted in the comments or the chat because that gives you an idea of where the idea of annulment came from and who it benefited over the course of many years, and still benefits to today. Because informally, what happens now is adoptive parents can essentially give back a child or disrupt the adoption, and essentially participate in an unregulated custody transfer, which people more informally call rehoming. So if you can do that, it makes zero sense to me that we should not have a right to annul our own adoptions and have the autonomy restored to us that we wish we had as adults. So let me get out of that one.
It's up.
Yay!
All right, great. Sorry about that, everybody. So with that background, I want to introduce Nikki Carlson. I don't even know, Nikki, if you use that last name anymore because it's no longer and that was the name of your adoptive parents. But Nikki, why don't you introduce yourself and then tell a little bit about how, or maybe the background of why you sought to vacate your adoption and how that operated for you and what you had to do. And I'm sure I'll probably interrupt and ask questions along the way.
No, I'm telling my whole life story. So
you have 5 minutes.
I was born in 1965, and then I was adopted in 1968. That was my first memory. I remember going on a plane with a social worker, and like there were pictures that said Mom, Dad, Kelly. I had a brother who was their biological son. And I never liked them. I never felt at home. I was not safe. It was a violent and abusive household, both of them, all of them. And and I always dreamed of meeting my birth mother. My dream was that she was going to come and rescue me, my birth mother. But I never knew who she was. I didn't know anything about her. I dreamed of her. I pictured her. I wondered what my name was, my real name. Well, my name was Mary, I should say that, up until I got adopted. And then the day I got adopted and moved into the Carlson's house, they changed my name to Nikki. So that was another thing that, saying your name is Nikki now. So I, like many, children from tough circumstances, got pregnant early, out of wedlock, had a baby. Then I got married, had another child. And by that time, I was really, 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 really serious about finding my biological mother. I gave some thought to my biological father, but anyway, and I couldn't do it on my own. I thought the path was to get my birth certificate, and I went to California and I couldn't do that. But then when I was 25, I went to my adoptive parents, now my former adoptive parents, and I asked them if they knew anything. And they said, well, yeah, they said, when you were about 12, in the mid 70s, we got contacted by a lawyer who represented your birth mother, and she wanted to meet you or support you some way. And we didn't think you were mature enough to handle that contact at that time, because you know how you were going through a really difficult time as a teenager. So then they said, write a letter to the attorney, my birth mother's attorney from the 1970s. He lived in our little town. And so I wrote him a letter, and he arranged contact with my birth mother. Her name was Nanette Kavanaugh. And she was a socialite in New York, and I met her twice. And then she said to me that she didn't want to ever see me again or have any contact with me. She said I was working class, we had nothing in common, and she just wasn't interested in a relationship. She had promised to introduce me to my biological half siblings. She never did, but she was on her third husband at the time when I met her. And her second husband was the one who facilitated finding me in the contact back in the 70s. And he was the one who reached out to me first to say, oh, I think your birth mother's going to contact you. And he stayed in touch with me all those years. But I asked him, even during that first contact, I said, who's my birth father? And he said, well, I can't tell you, your birth mother swore me to secrecy. So then in 2015, that guy, Arthur, who was my birth mother's second husband, or second ex-husband and second husband, contacted me, and he said, look, I'm 92 and I want you to come to San Miguel, and I'm going to tell you who your birth father is. I've had 2 strokes and I just don't want to take this information to my deathbed. So I went down there. He told me, your father's name is Mario D'Urso. and he is an aristocrat from Rome, Italy. And then I Googled him and I found him and I wrote him an email, and he wanted to meet me. And so we met in Milan. And the day that we met, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. So that was March 15th of 2015. And then 3 months later, he died, June 15th. And him dying felt like everybody died, like everybody was dead. Any hopes I ever had of, even though I didn't even know him and I didn't really have a concept of him when he died anyway. So I went to Rome to the funeral, and I hadn't really met any of the family, but I'd met a lot of his friends. And so the family was really suspicious. They didn't want me to come into the church. They kicked us out of my daughter was really close with Mario too, had actually spent more time with him than I did. And they kicked her out of the family section. I didn't have the nerve to even try to sit there. And then I went home, and that was 5 minutes. Okay, so in one sentence, then one run-on sentence, my cousins contacted me because the will didn't turn out the way it was supposed to. Like somebody had left something for me in the will, but then he said it was for him, or an earmark. And so my cousins contacted me and asked if we could all do a DNA test together, because all the money in the will, and it was like 25 million euro, went to strangers outside the family, the people who were around him when he died, and he was on intravenous morphine, and he's a lawyer, and no Dursa would ever do a will like that. They believed it was a fraudulent will. So we did a DNA test. It proved I was the father. And then we were trying to get a declaration of paternity in Italy. And Italy told me, you can't if you've been adopted. And so my lawyers told me, go back to the United States and get your adoption vacated. So I did with Greg's help. And then my birth mother and the residual heir to my father's estate, they got together and they sued me to try and intervene in my adoption vacation and force the Carlsons to readopt me. And then that took a long time in court, and they lost. I can't say I really won, but so Greg can tell you the details of that.
But
anyway,
but Nikki, I mean, it wasn't a good adoption for you either, right? I mean, it was something that you wish you could have done probably years ago.
Well, I never heard of the concept. I mean, if I'd known of the concept, I would have done it, but I didn't learn of the concept until Italy told me I needed to, and I was like, great, I mean, so the judge kept saying, you can't tell me that you wanted to vacate your adoption. You can't tell me I don't believe you. The only reason you're doing this is for the money. And I'm like, well, it's maybe the money. I mean, I don't even know. That may never happen. But at the same time, now I'm Maria Nicoletta D'Urso, I'm not Nikki Carlson anymore. And I have a family there, cousins who I talk to every day, who I visit and go stay with, and cousins' children. And I've never had a family like that. We're close. It's great. I mean, I didn't really have to vacate my adoption to have that family connection, but I kind of did, I mean,
do you feel that, I mean, I've known you for a few years now, and I assume that it was a good development that you were able to vacate your adoption.
Yeah, it was like having an enema. Like,
and then so I mean, I could say a little bit, when you first came to me, you had been through a bunch of lawyers, I think, as well, and
yeah,
and I took a look at it, and I thought, oh my God, this is going to be incredibly hard to do. Annulments are very hard. There was an element of fraud in your case that we thought that we could pursue. And so that was there. But then we determined that the best way to do this is to get the agreement of your adoptive parents to vacate it.
Yeah.
In which they did. Well, and so we had, so all the parties of the adoption, adoptive parents, the adoptee is not quite a party to an adoption. That's a whole nother issue, but had agreed that it's in your best interest to vacate it. And we submitted the order to the judge in the agreement, and the judge signed off on it.
Yeah.
Once that happened, that's when your mom went berserk, your birth mom.
Yeah.
And challenged the ability to vacate the adoption. Now, this is a birth mom who had signed off all rights whatsoever of control over you. Coming back and saying that she had a right to object to vacating your adoption. I mean, we can get into those issues too, because those issues involve, I think, birth parents worrying about having this relationship restored and inheritance issues and things like that. And we'll get to that at the end of the discussion, but I think that's partially what was driving it. But my guess too was also she was being used by folks in Italy to challenge the adoption so that those folks in Italy could benefit from the will.
It was so weird. So the relinquishment was in 1965 and the adoption was in 1968. And her attorney, Gary, remember?
Mm-hmm.
That fucker. He kept
saying, this is being recorded.
Well, if you can edit it then. So
I'm joking.
So I had tried to hire him and I told him my whole story and I paid him a consultation fee and he wouldn't take my case because he didn't want to get into vacating adoptions. And then my mother hired him and we filed a disqualification motion and he refused to disqualify. And even the judge accepted him and let him argue the case, the first judge. But anyway, so he kept saying that there was this careful adoption plan that she consented to. She never consented to the adoption plan. She was married and had other children by the time I was adopted.
Right. And then, so as a result of the vacating the adoption, you had your original birth certificate restored.
Yeah. So now my birth certificate is the first page. Can you show it, Greg?
I can. Yeah, let me get it. But go ahead and talk about it. And I'll get it.
Slippery slope of getting it on your screen.
You're gonna screen.
I don't know. I'm not sure if I want to do that. Yeah.
Well, I can just tell you, I could run upstairs and get it. But on the first, it says baby girl Miller. So I never had, and then it says my birth mother's name, and then father is blank. And then it has a fake address, my mother's spelling is my mother's name is, didn't she put a fake name on there? Nanette Miller, right? That was.
She did. She put the name of her grandmother, last name of her grandmother.
Yeah, so her name wasn't even Miller; it was her mother's maiden name.
Right. So
she was really they were really trying to hide any possibility of being found, and so now that's my birth certificate, and then there's a stapled attachment to my birth certificate, the second page, that is an official change of name from baby girl Miller to Nikki K. Carlson. So I've got a 2-page birth certificate.
Right.
And I kind of think that's how birth certificates should be, like your birth certificate and then an adoption connected to it. Why do they change the birth certificate?
That's a whole nother issue. That's a whole nother, I mean, I agree with you in that respect, except for what you need to hand in to, let's say, the Little League or school or whatever, that you don't have to, if for some reason you don't want to reveal your entire life and adoption, you just give whoever your legal parent is. So
I suppose.
Yeah.
But if you think about this, remember, Claudia, we were laughing about this. Every single county must have some document forgers in place because they transferred the signature of my birth mother onto my birth certificate.
Right.
They transferred, and then and then they faked it and then they unfaked it. I mean, it's crazy.
And I'm seeing some questions in the chat, and we'll get to those. Annette's going to be monitoring that. She's really good at making sure that we answer those. So if you have a question as we're having this discussion, feel free to. You could certainly raise your hand, or you could put the question in chat, and we'll get to it.
There's one that just keeps repeating, Greg, and that's that you would get your original birth certificate, but would you be able then to get a passport and those types of things?
Right. So the what will be hard in those issues. If you need a passport, you have to show you have to show how your name has changed over time. And so if you have all the documents, whether it's the, your amended birth certificate, then the vacating of the adoption, and then your original birth certificate, then that's how you would be able to get a passport. But what I would also recommend, and I think if you ever do an annulment or a vacation, that you put in the order whether your name changes or not, because that's going to be a consideration you're going to have to deal with. And so put in that order in the annulment that, and henceforth, the person shall be known as. And then so you have that record of a name change that you can trace it from your original birth record to what happened to your name when you got an annulment. That's really how it works. I mean, it's going to be one of those questions, and I think we're going to get a lot of these questions during this conversation, is like, what about inheritance? What about your birth record? What about, do the birth parents have a parental right at that point? Or what about citizenship issues for those who are intercountry adoptees? And we'll talk about those towards the end. But those are sort of open questions because, very few people I know of 2 in the U.S. that have gotten annulments. I know one who's actually going through the process right now in Ohio. And I thought he was going to be here tonight to talk, but apparently not. But those are open questions that we have to resolve. And one thought was that you have the simple right to annul your adoption, and that it is annulled and your birth certificate is restored. If you want things beyond that, there may be a second process you have to go through. If you want to restore any specific rights to a birth parent who may not know that you're annulling your adoption, that may be a second process to go through, because I imagine you would have to give notice to that person that certain rights are being restored that they had relinquished decades ago.
Greg,
Go ahead.
sorry, I'm sorry. I was just thinking about what I said, like the way I said it, and the way I felt then, and the way I've, now I'm much more in the Italian court, and so there everybody talks about the money all the time. So when I sounded like I did sound like a gold digger, didn't I? So I'm sorry, I just have to say this. So in Italy, it's totally different than the United States. There's this American ethos here of being self-made. And in Italy, it's different. You are who your parents are in your family. They don't have a bunch of adoption where, and plus most people are Italian. So here, this melting pot or whatever, that there's that American ethos, but there, people, when I found out that Mario was my father, they talked immediately about me annulling my adoption before he had even died, and changing my name. Are you going to change your name? I mean, that was right away. So here it wouldn't happen. People are like, isn't it just enough to know? Isn't it just enough to have the knowledge?
Right.
Isn't it just enough that, you, like, even the judge said that, isn't it just enough that, why didn't you do it in your 20s, in your 30s, if it was so traumatic? Why are you waiting or your 40s? Why are you waiting to your 50s? And then I didn't know I could.
Right. And I have to say too that we had 2 different judges in the case, and the first judge is just assigned, and that's who we got. And she was incredibly hostile to the concept of vacating the adoption, even though the adoptive parents had agreed to it. Incredibly hostile, and every trope associated with being an adult adopted person came out of that session we had with her, and that Nikki's an angry adoptee, that she's a gold digger, she's interested in inheritance, all that. That it wasn't simply an issue of it wasn't a good adoption, which it wasn't, and that wanted it vacated. And for whatever reason you wanted it too, should be fine. I mean, I saw a question about, can you vacate your adoption if both your adoptive parents are dead? Again, getting back to this whole idea that there's a sort of a 2-step process. Yes, I think you should. It should be easy to annul your adoption as an adult. I don't think people are going to be doing it willy-nilly. I think it'll be a minority of adult adopted people who actually annul their adoption. But it should be a right to do it. And your adoptive parents, because you can be adopted by anyone else at any time with their consent, I don't see how you would have to provide notice to the adoptive parents that you're annulling the adoption, especially if they're obvious. You can't give notice to someone who's dead.
Greg,
Yeah.
my mother argued that that vacating the adoption would restore a relationship with her.
Right.
And I knew she was afraid that I wanted her money. So I wrote her a letter saying, look, I'm happy to do an agreement with you saying that I cannot inherit anything from you or your family at all. And she just ignored it and then said that that was her fear. And then the second judge said, I'd like to hear from all the attorneys. Remember the first thing she sat down because the first judge disqualified herself because she said she knew my second attorney.
By the way, you didn't fire me. You just got another attorney. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it got
Right.
it got out of control. There were so many.
Right.
They had two big law firms on their side,
Right.
you know, and two plaintiffs, and I was just one defendant. And we needed another law firm, you know.
Right.
Kind of.
Exactly. It was a good choice. It was a good decision. Yeah.
Thanks. No, Greg's the greatest lawyer.
I wasn't fishing for
The
that.
greatest. I know. But it was a great team. But so the judge rightly asked, like this person just did, she said, since she was relinquished in 1965 and adopted in 1968, does anyone think that this adoption vacation restores a relationship with the birth mother? And both attorneys said, we argue it does. And Greg says, we argue it doesn't. You know?
There's no way. I mean, I could see an inheritance issue there if you're restored, if your original birth certificate is restored. But there's also the relinquishment document where any and all right is relinquished, and you have that adoption that did terminate those parental rights and obligations as well. That order, even though that the actual adoption is vacated, I think it's an open question, and I think because that it's an open question, it will be threatening to birth parents that somehow an annulled adoption, the birth child will come back and try to claw into some sort of inheritance. And I think that's going to be one of those issues that has to get resolved in a second process. Essentially, if you are seeking inheritance rights, then you have to provide notice to the birth parent to do so. Yeah, I think it's going to, if we're going to do annulments correctly, I think it's going to be a two-part process. One is, and I think we'll talk to Linnell Long about this in Australia. One is sort of this easy, you file and, you know, as long as you're not, as long as you're competent and know what you're doing, it should be granted. And then beyond that, establishing new rights or reestablishing old rights is going to be a secondary question that's going to have to be answered in a more formal court proceeding. That's my, again, we're having a conversation. That's my thought is how this would work. If you're to have a process that is going to restore certain rights, those rights of relationship with another person. So,
Right.
yeah.
I've gotten a couple of private messages. If before we continue, if you can just define the differences between annulment, vacate, and rescind.
So it'll vary by state, typically those definitions, but annulment and rescission should roughly be the same. And in many respects, an annulment means what you had is null and void, that it does not exist anymore, and as if it never existed. So it is, annulment is a incredibly powerful tool. Vacating an adoption is essentially the adoption is vacated and it still exists as something that occurred, and you can bring up and use in legal arguments and things like that, but it doesn't control you, and it doesn't control you anymore. So, you know, it's like marriage annulments. It's like a marriage annulment is a powerful tool to just the marriage never existed, as opposed to divorce, in which you're ending that relationship, that marriage relationship. So that's somewhat the equivalent. I mean, I've seen all sorts. I've seen null and void. I've seen voiding. I've seen annulling, vacating. But annulling is the most powerful one, and vacating is a sort of a lesser one. Does that make sense?
Thank you. I've gotten thank you messages. So yes.
Oh, good. And Claude and Max will get to you. I'm going to do a real quick segue to have Linnell talk about what's happening in Australia, which I think they call it a discharge as opposed to annulment. And I may be incorrect about that as well. But again, to show that this isn't some concept that we're just sort of coming out of thin air with. I mean, it's existed in a number of states over the course of many years, but it also exists in other countries, and especially in Australia, which Linnell may wince when I say this, seems to be much more progressive on adoption issues than the U.S. So, Linnell, could you talk a little bit about what happens and what rights Australian adoptees have?
Yeah, I will just preface that by saying we actually have two people on here more able to talk about that than I, Peter Coppola-Moore and Daryl Nelson, who are both domestic adoptees. I'm going to talk about it from the inter-country adoptee perspective because that's what I deal with, and it is obviously slightly more complex. So my situation in Australia is I'm going through the process of annulling my adoption through the state of Victoria. And that in our legislation, it does vary state to state as to how and why you can do it. So in some states here, you are only allowed to annul or apply for it if you have good reason. So, and part of that reason in some of the state legislations includes, you know, if you've suffered abuse or a really terrible experience, and you can provide proof of that. So for me, I'm actually going through a criminal process with my adoptive family right now, and my annulment will follow as a result of that, because of the fact that I'll have obvious definite proof of you know, a terrible adoption. When I do that, this is where it gets more complicated for intercountry adoptees. So my situation is I actually don't have any birth documentation from my birth country. My adoption was completely illegal. There is no documentation on me at all that I've ever found. I'm in the process of still trying to seek that from Vietnam, because with one detective, private detective there, I did manage to find what appears to be a birth certificate, but you know, who knows, you know, so much documentation over there is falsified and forged anyway. So what I understand for my situation is that when I go through the discharge of an adoption, I will revert back to having no documentation, being stateless. So it raises some interesting questions for intercountry adoptees because, you know, you wonder, oh, can I be deported? Will I not have citizenship anymore? My understanding of that is all of the statuses that I have through my adoption, such as citizenship, that kind of thing, still stays in place. So an adoption discharge will not make me citizenless in Australia. All it's doing is simply revoking my relationship legally to my adoptive family and allowing me then by choice to go back to whatever name I choose if I don't have any paperwork that's firm. It's very similar to also the situation that my good friend in Denmark had, an Indian adoptee who I've done her story on ICAV some little while ago, where she revoked her adoption as well. And because she also didn't have any paperwork, an adoption, birth certificate, that kind of thing from India, from her birth country, she was also given a choice as to what name and identity she chose to have. And of course, as you were alluding to before, Greg, where if you put it through your process and in your documentation that your name change, you keep that trail, that obviously is the best way to ensure that, you know, you've got proof and documentation. So from an intercountry point of view, it is slightly more complex. We actually have had two intercountry adoptions done in the South Australian state that I'm aware of. And yeah, so in Australia, it's a much more common practice. I don't know the statistics in Australia for domestic adoptees. Probably Peter and Daryl could tell you that, but I'm very aware that here, you know, because of all the adoption legislation reviews that happen, some of the states are like every 5 or 3 years. The adoptees with their movements have actually advocated for and made sure that that right to annulment is actually in our legislation. And I can see that Peter actually wrote there earlier that they're even now pushing for that to be a no fee. Because at the moment, for example, I have to actually pay $550 to even apply to have my adoption revoked in state of Victoria. Now that fee is different for each state. So it's not like it's a set fee across the whole country. And again, you know, that's something that needs to be addressed in terms of equity, and you know, there shouldn't be a disincentive and barriers for us to go through this process. So that's what I'll share with you from that. If
Yeah, it
there's any
sounds. It
questions.
sounds. I mean, many states. Not. I shouldn't say many, but there were a few states over the years that had what's called a good cause provision. So that if you had good cause, you could annul your own adoption or vacate your own adoption. How long did it take, and what was the process for getting a right or a statutory right to discharge your adoption in Australia? How did that develop over the years, and how long did it take?
I might ask Peter or Daryl. Probably Daryl's probably the most expert here who's done it before. Daryl, would you like to talk about this? Because I'm still going through the process, whereas Daryl's already completely gone through.
Sure. The process, if you're asking me when the law came into account, I think it was around 2009, where it became easier. Prior to that, you could discharge, and I think there was different laws to go under, but I don't think it was called discharge. My discharge took about 18 months, but the court part of that was quite quick. But the preparation of the materials, you have to notify everyone who is involved. That is anyone that has a say, although in theory, you know, your interests are paramount. Anyone involved in an adoption, from birth parents to adoptive parents, should be invited into the case to have their say. In my case, it went to the Supreme Court of Queensland, so the highest court of Queensland. Victoria is different. It just goes to Magistrates Court, I understand. Mine cost me $1,000. I had quotes from lawyers and barristers for $140,000 to manage the case, and they had really no experience. So I decided, well, I'll do it myself. I don't have any experience in law, but I can read. So I, read the different laws. In Queensland, there are different proof levels required. You have to prove fraud or special circumstances, exceptional circumstances, which is what most discharges go under in Australia. I think, from my knowledge, there's only been about between 12 and 20 discharges happen in Australia in that time period, but they don't publish them mostly, so you don't know what's going on. As adoptees and adoptee network, we don't know what's happening unless people are involved in the adoption network. So in my case, I had to, I think I had a valid proof for different, like every criteria that I could apply under, I applied under those and had proof for those. Some, less proof than I would want. The state of Queensland didn't have a position, but they assisted the judge. So they actually built a case against my case on every legal point that they could, except for exceptional circumstances, which is typically, as you said, Linnell, either because you're sexually abused or mentally abused in the adoption, or if you have another reason such as mental health. So an adoptee has to prove they have mental health issues because of the adoption. Typically, you need, a psychologist's written testimony about that. Although recently there was a case that didn't need that, but typically that's what you have to do, which is another aspect
that sounds a little bit like a nightmare.
It was. I mean, you have to divide yourself, and as adoptees, we're used to, partitioning ourselves off,
right, and
pleasing different areas of, adoptees. That's a life, right? I had to be a prosecutor, a legal investigator, a victim, I had to be all those things at different times. So that sometimes takes an emotional toll on you.
Yeah, I can't imagine there would be that many adoptees that would want to go through that.
It's pretty hard. And in the end of the day, the thing I'll finish off with was the judge, even though I had all those proofs of the different grounds, there was only one ground that wasn't challenged by government, and that was the ground he awarded me under, which is exceptional circumstances or mental health.
Right.
He wouldn't rule on the other grounds because he didn't have to, and that's what he
Right.
said.
That sounds like a judge that wanted the easy way. Yeah, which is good. Yeah.
I wanted a decision. I wanted someone to tell me, no, you're wrong, Daryl. But unfortunately, the judge wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, I know that my grounds, because I'm going through a criminal process and a high likelihood of winning, I know that my grounds will be pretty valid and unchallenged.
Is the process in your state different from Daryl's?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
It's like the USA. Every
Yeah.
state has different legislation.
Except we have 50 plus DC, which is
Yeah.
a lot of states to
Yep.
deal with. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thanks, Daryl. I really appreciate you sharing that, and thanks, Linnell, as well. And it makes me wonder that we should do a program solely on discharges in Australia, because I think we would learn a lot from that. And I want to talk to you at some point again about how you got to the point where you were able to get new laws that would allow you to do that, and what was involved in getting those laws passed that now allow you to have a discharge, although it sounds somewhat difficult to do still. Yeah,
there's new laws coming, I think, that make it easier. They're on the horizon, especially in Victoria.
Right.
But other states are a bit slow to pick up the game.
Great. Well, thanks. I really appreciate it. We're going to switch quickly now to Claude and Max. And Claudia, why don't you introduce yourself and then follow that with Max? And we're going to shift essentially into a concept that's not annulment, because the adoption really, the current adoption kind of still exists, but it's readoption, or adopting back, or essentially what it really is. It's an adult adoption that Claude and Max are considering. And so, Claude, why don't you introduce yourself, then Max, you can do so as well.
So, I'm Claudia Cargan Darcy, and I am a birth mother, first mother, whatever you want to call me, doesn't really matter. I don't cry. In any case, typical traditional domestic closed adoption, 1987. So we were in the, adoption is a wonderful way to build a family, and I was a wonderful, strong, selfless family building angel and all that good stuff. So, I drank all the Kool-Aid and thought I was a family building angel for a couple of years until I found Google, and been here ever since. So long story short, I spent probably the first 15, 20 years, 12, 15 years thinking, oh, okay, I was a great family building angel, and then went along. And then in 2004 is when I found Max. In 2007 is when we in contact, and we have been in, I would say it's a bit more than a reunion now, since 2007. And there he is. So I'll let you do the rest.
So Max. I don't really know what the hell's up there, but yeah, Claudia is my biological blood mother. I was raised in Massachusetts, one state over, by a very unpleasant and neurologically unwell family. It was bad. And I hadn't really heard anything about readoption or annulment maybe 6 months ago or something when you brought it up to me. Maybe a little bit longer than that. It's relatively recent. And yeah, so I'm still, wrapping my head around the concept. Obviously, adoption didn't work out too well for me the first time around, so I'm a little skeptical of it the second time around.
So could you talk a little bit about, what would prevent you? I mean, not let's say, there's financial costs often. If you hire lawyers, there's emotional issues there as well, I'm sure. And then what do you think are the issues that make you think twice about readoption? I think you've mentioned it already. It's like, why do another one?
I mean, honestly, that's a big part of it. I know for everyone in the adoption world, identity for adoptees is like a big thing, and mine's been so well established for so long that you know, a readoption, annulment, anything like that seems like a little bow on top. The other thing is I want to avoid any legal contact with my adoptive parents, who I don't see that working out well for me mentally or financially.
And that's something that, you know, would be concern for me if we started to work towards annulment, whether the courts would require notice to adoptive parents, especially in relationships that were abusive. So that,
Well,
yeah. And so readoption, you would avoid that. There's
Right.
typically no need to involve the adoptive parents.
Well,
at
that's it. It's
all.
kind of
Yeah.
it's kind of funny because number one, we have been talking about it longer, except that you don't remember because we're in the garage.
Oh, right.
Established that. So we've had many conversations kind of over the years, but often on holidays when we're at parties and there might be alcohol involved. So we don't remember the next
No,
day
that's
that
fair. I
we
would say
have
we
these
have-
great conversations.
We haven't
But,
been considering it seriously till recently, or at least I have.
Exactly.
Put it that way.
We've talked
That's
about it
more
more
accurate.
seriously. And it's really funny. I was just listening to what happens in Australia. I'm thinking, wow, we are so lucky. The US, like, because I'm in New York, right? We're both in New York now. So in New York, the law for readoption, for adopting an adult adoption is like nothing. I mean, I think there is I have to be in the state for 3 months. So I have to have, live here for 3 months, which I've definitely met that criteria. And everybody has to consent, and that's it. So it would be really easy. And I'm thinking, wow, it'd be great, except of course the fact that I've already said we will not do it until he can get his OPC. So we have to change a whole law in the state before we do it. If we ever do it, which we might not. I mean, we might not. That's the whole thing. Because it's kind of weird. And is it necessary?
You consider it weird to readopt?
No, well, not weird. I mean, I think the adding of the layers
Yeah.
of it's not undoing, it's adding more.
Right.
Right.
I agree. Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like, we're still playing with their rules. We're hacking them to do what we want. But it still doesn't, like, when we're talking before about, the relationship with birth families still based on that, the relinquishment still stands, right? Like, so that we're not burning that piece of paper up. Now, granted, the relinquishment really only relinquished my parental rights and responsibilities until age 21, right? So after he's 21, there are no real parenting responsibilities, but are there? I mean, there's next of kin.
Right.
Like, who gets to decide if I stay on the, breathing machine? You gonna unplug me? Who gets to unplug me?
And those are real issues. I mean, yeah. I think those are that second process to figure out what, if you do annul, or what does that mean in these very critical areas. I mean, let's grant the annulment, but these other things that you don't have rights to decide whether you're get taken off a machine unless those rights are established.
Exactly.
Right.
So, I mean, like, they could considerably, like, granted, he's now the oldest, Max is now my oldest living sibling. He should have, he has that criteria. But if Garen wanted to be a jerk, Garen could probably be like, no, I'm deciding if mom stays on the breathing machine or not, because you're not legally here. Like, so those things are weird.
Right.
And how do you negotiate around them?
Right. Yeah, so the adult adoption is super easy. But I mean, I shouldn't say it's super easy. There's the emotional stuff behind it. But what's so strange about the readoption process is that, let's say you went through with it in New York. Typically, in most states, the adoptive parents, which would be you,
right,
could decide whether a new amended birth certificate should be issued.
Which would be a New York one instead of a
New York
one.
Right. And so then you'd have you could potentially have a new amended birth certificate that is almost exactly the same as the original. But I bet you could ask that the original just be restored.
Well, if we did the adoption back in New York.
Right, I was born in Massachusetts.
Yeah, see, he was born in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, he's still donated. So would New York have the ability to tell Massachusetts to reinstate the OBC? Because of course the relinquishment was in Massachusetts. So that's why I'm like, no matter how easy it might be in New York, we still have years to even play with the idea, because until we can actually get the original OBC, it's not as appealing.
Right.
At
I
least to
think
me.
a court.
I'll
I
do
think
whatever.
a court. I think a court could. I mean, the court could certainly, if it was a readoption and you agreed that a new birth certificate would be issued, that order goes to Massachusetts, and they follow that order and issue a new amended one. I can imagine you could convince the court to restore the old because it's no different. But it's an open question. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm legally a different name, right? Because I'm not just Corrigan anymore.
Right.
So
I'm
it
saying, I
isn't-
mean, and I agree. I think it's messy, but I think it's
is.
necessary.
No, I like the
And-
mess.
Yeah, I think we have to live with that mess, but I think we're skilled in dealing with it, and we could figure it out.
Oh, yeah.
It's not hard. I think what I fear about whether it's readoption or annulment, I fear the backlash from the adoption agency perspective, from some adoptive parents, and potentially from mothers like Nikki's mom, who are threatened by, as they are now, even with the original birth certificates, that suddenly they're going to come back and they're going to show up at my door and they're going to want to have a relationship, and I'm responsible for them. So I'm fearful of that backlash, actually, and I think it would be significant. So I think, this is something you talk about years. I think that's where we are in establishing what Australia in some respects already has. And it's going to take a long time to get this, but I think it's necessary. I'm willing to work on it, but I think we're going to have these conversations, a lot of them,
Oh, yeah.
to figure out what's in the best interest of the adopted person.
Oh, absolutely. As an
and annulment.
adoptee, the right should be on the table. Even if it's not personally for me now at this moment, my situation is not everyone's situation. And it's about your own legal rights. It's having legal autonomy.
Right. Autonomy is a huge issue for me. That's where, we talk about, we had no autonomy as children, obviously, and we made no decisions about where we would be. I mean, that's maybe true with a lot of children, but not with adoptees. It's a distinct lack of autonomy. And this is reclaiming that autonomy if you feel like you need to reclaim it. And I think that should be recognized. But again, I think it's going to be, we have issues that we have to talk about and work out. What's the process going to look like? What happens with the birth records? What kind of rights are reestablished or not reestablished? And if they are reestablished, what's the process to do that? And this issue of citizenship, that for intercountry adoptees, I don't see it for the U.S. immigration law as a huge issue, especially if you already have citizenship. I would worry about those who did not have citizenship and they relied upon adoption for that citizenship. So that would be
The question, Gregory, on that, in using the readoption, could it be a solution for those who don't have citizenship to be readopted now? Has any
No, because everything
intercountry
had to
adoptee
happen.
thought of doing that? Oh, it had to
Well,
have happened before the
yeah.
83
you
cut
had
off.
you had to be everything to immigrate and become a U.S. citizen as an adoptee. You have to do before 18. Once you hit 18, once you hit
Nationally?
19, yeah, you
Oh,
can't.
wow.
I mean, you could.
Okay,
I mean,
so they couldn't use
You
it.
could adopt and then you could petition. You can go through the whole immigration process to petition for them to become an immigrant, but no, it would be too complicated. Not worth it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
but those who have already established citizenship, especially if it's a certificate of citizenship where you acquired it from your adoptive parents already, they can't undo that citizenship. I would be worried about the process for those who need to naturalize. And, for instance, let's say that they voted in a U.S. election. There's an exemption if your parents were adopted. I mean, if your parents are U.S. citizens or you're adopted by U.S. citizens, and if you're undoing that adoption, that could create a real issue or problem. So that's one of those big issues that we have to address.
Greg, hi. I just want to say I recently contacted the Colombian consulate in San Francisco, because my birthday is so off, my real birthday versus my legal birthday on my birth certificate. And I was told that I should be really careful about stirring that up and trying to get my birth certificate in Colombia because of, even though I am a US citizen, that I came into this country, and so many of us come into this country with false paperwork, and that if that would be proven at that point by opening that up. So I don't want to, I don't want to take any more of the time at this, and I would absolutely want to hear more about Claudia and Max, but I just really caution anyone who is an international adoptee to be really, really careful about that.
Right, I agree. I think it's it should probably be one of these issues. One of the big four, obviously, one is citizenship, but it should probably be expanded to citizenship/immigration, because those who don't have citizenship are still considered immigrants and don't have it. So yeah, I agree. We should. And thanks, Astrid, for letting us or participating with that.
Shalise has her hand up as well.
Shalise, yeah, go ahead, Shalise.
So I have a question, and I don't know. I've been thinking about what you were saying about the backlash and what that might be like, and so I feel like, not to insult anyone in this room, but scrolling through the pages, like, we are all people adopted at a certain time, and so I'm wondering, does anyone who's working in adoption right now, maybe Claudia or Greg, since you see a wider range of adoption, timeframes, is it, and I think I kind of know the answer to this, but is it like common practice still in adoption, private adoption through agencies, for them to create this idea to, like, birth mothers, that they'll never, if they don't want to have contact, they'll never have to have contact with their kids again?
So I guess
I was just saying, like for the backlash and changing that, right? Part of it's going to have to be encouraging or educating or directing adoption professionals, people who are facilitating adoptions, to say this is not a finite process. Because, well, one, because we live in the time of the internet, and Google makes it so this is not a finite process. 23andMe makes it so you can't ever be found. Where I feel like, baby scoop era and that time, it was more possible to say that with some degree of certainty that you could remain anonymous. And so I'm just wondering if anyone who works in adoption, like, knows what kind of guarantees they're making. Because I just feel like any person who, like, has a smartphone knows that, like, you can be found, and so I'm wondering how convincing that that rhetoric still is, and, like, how prevalent it is, and then also, what do we do to start changing that?
Right,
It's definitely still there, because we hear that it's the OBC battle. That is the OBC battle of, oh, what if they don't want to be found? And if we open up the records, then women aren't going to relinquish. And so I'll give you the answer that I've been giving to legislators for years, which is research in the 1970s from and on clearly shows us that mothers don't want to relinquish because they want to know what happens to their children, right? That's why women stopped choosing relinquishment. And in response to that, and the numbers of adoption going down in the 70s, we have open adoption. And adoption numbers increase when mothers can have knowledge of what happens to their children. And then you go into, of course, exactly as you said, that now it's DNA, that we cannot promise anonymity. The other thing too that goes back to that, which we used with the OBC legislation constantly, which is even to this day, like New York State adoption law, it's in the code. Open adoptions are practiced regularly, but there's still a whole line in the code that says no party in this adoption, including the attorneys, shall release the surname of the relinquishing parent, right? So, like, that's still there, even though we're doing open adoptions constantly. So there's still that huge discrepancy between the laws as they've been written and the practice as it is currently happening. And it's funny because you see a lot still, of course, domestic adoption, domestic infant is the promises of, open adoptions, of course, move the whole machine at this point. They're not staying open, but of course, they're often being closed on mothers, even though mothers do run away from them too. So, I mean, so they are closing, but they're not closing in the get-go, unless there's total duplicity on part of the relinquishment. But they're still closing, but there's never been promises. There never have been. But we're still battling that backlash. But we've been doing that with everything on adoption forever. So it's just more of, we all just got to keep on doing what we do and pushing that envelope and educating, because, well, we're getting there.
Yeah, the policy stuff. I mean, I probably need to pay I probably need to pay Annette royalties for always talking about this concept that it's the older legislators that are the ones who buy into the mythology of secrecy and adoption and the redemption of, especially in the white domestic infant adoption back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They buy into that mythology, and it's incredibly hard to shake them from that mythology. So as Shalise is talking about, as we're moving forward, that becomes less and less so. I'm pessimistic now, though, as with, and I have to say this, with Justice Coney Barrett's comment about promoting safe haven laws, which encourage the anonymous abandonment of children with the expectation that you would remain anonymous. And so that, I think that as we had in the 40s, 50s, and 60s with this idea of redemption and secrecy and, preserving the white concept of middle-class white motherhood, we may shift back to that depending upon who's in power and how that power is being defined and judicially determined. So I think it is, it's up in the air, but I'm optimistic, like Shalise, in that way, that we can change the narrative and deal with the backlash, but I'm still concerned. Yeah.
Greg, Moses has a question regarding the UN's, excuse me, the rights of a child, and now it just went away.
Well, I mean, I love
pursuing it in the U.S. a way to address the OBC issue and citizenship issue, and is it a reason why things are so messy and complicated in the U.S., armed with the knowledge that the U.S. never ratified?
That's it. Yeah, I wish they had. I mean, I think Article 7 of that talks about the right of the child to know, essentially where they came from. And not all even the ratifying states, the countries, agree with that interpretation that the OBC would then be, that there should not be any anonymity in birth, but it is a barrier. I use that that convention in my arguments to legislators, but I haven't heard them. I don't think they know enough to say, well, we've never ratified it. But those who do would certainly come back with that issue. I wish we had. In a perfect world, I think adoptees would take up that issue of getting the U.S. to ratify that convention. But it's a great question. I wish we could
My son
use it.
spoke about that in his social studies class in 6th grade.
Who did?
Brendan. He started asking his social studies teacher, because that's about the time when I had started getting into activism and stuff. And they were talking about it in his social studies class. And he was like, I got a couple of questions for you. And the teacher had absolutely no answer for him at all, other than, we haven't ratified it, so it's not going to make a difference.
Right. I just see that Linnell said exactly the same thing. And so and so basically thanks Linnell for already saying that. But I do think it could be an organizing concept for adoptees to rally, and others too, allies, to rally around the U.S. finally ratifying that, because I think what it comes down to is this issue of states' rights, and the states can do what they want to regulate the family, if they want to regulate the family, which they do quite often.
Well, what is it with the rights of the child now? It used to be that only it was like the United States and Somalia were the only countries that hadn't ratified it. And I think Somalia actually did now.
I think we're the
And,
only state. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're the only country that hasn't. So it's really good if you're like trying to make it, like drill that point home and you say, well, it used to be United States and Somalia. And then say,
Keep in
did it.
mind. Keep in mind that all of these other hundreds of countries that have ratified the right to identity in the UNCRC, that at the moment, you know, with the organisation I just listed there that I'm working with, we are trying to hold those countries more accountable to protect the right to identity. And to part of the convention actually talks about speedily restoring our right to identity when we flag as victims that our identity has been obliterated. And for those who don't know about what happens internationally, we have just had our first inter-country adoptee in the Netherlands, Patrick Nordoven, illegally adopted from Brazil. He just won his case in the Netherlands court about 2 weeks ago, where he won not only 3 years prior, he had won his right to identity as his own case in a legal court, but he then has now been given compensation, the right to be paid compensation for the state not protecting his right to identity. So it's really, really important what's going on internationally, and that organisation that I'm working with now as their special advisor, doing huge amounts of work to really bring this issue to the forefront and to get organisations collaborating, because this right to identity affects not just adoption, it's surrogacy, it's every other family formation technology that obliterates that child's identity by falsifying or creating some other, you know, donor conceived children. It affects all of us, so many of us. So it's really important work.
No, I agree totally. Thanks, Linnell. Because yeah, that's how we develop allies. We develop allies with the donor conceived community. We develop allies with other cultural communities, and I think the right to identity is how we go forward, at least in the U.S., on the issue of all sorts of things, whether it's an original birth certificate or deals with issues in foster care for youth. So I wish that we would ratify it, but I think we're watching those cases in the Netherlands and maybe in Sweden and maybe in Switzerland and others that may establish that right more forcefully. So thanks so much. I should say that I have a hard stop at 7:30. I have to get on a flight. But I think Annette is going to be the host and will continue if we don't finish up by 7:30. But Annette, are there any other questions or anyone else want to raise their hand and have a
Unless
question?
anyone raises a hand, I have to say thank you, Linnell, because she's been answering all of the questions in the chat.
Happy to help you guys. We're on the same page.
I appreciate it so much. As of Daryl and Peter, I don't think Shalise has her hand up. I see. Well, Shalise, you unmute and ask your question, and I'll scroll back just to make sure that.
One thing I do want to say that and sort of point out, you know, if you want to take sort of one step forward on this, the adoptees I hear a lot from are in step-parent adoptions, and their biological father typically has been essentially erased from their life, and they want to reclaim that. And this annulment of the adoption of that one individual, the stepfather, could be one way to sort of get our fingers into the right to annulment, because that's, I think, is a very clear one that should be available to adult adoptees who no longer want this stepfather or whoever adopted them as a step parent as their legal parent anymore. And I've that in some have relates to citizenship rights that they had until they were adopted by a step parent, and no longer have those citizenship rights that their father would have given them. So though that would be one more simple way to get our fingers into this issue if we wanted to take it at a slower pace. But that's just a thought. We have a lot of great comments in the chat, so we'll save that.
I don't see anyone with their hands up or any questions that were missed. I just want to make sure, because I know not everyone always is able to keep up with the chat, that everyone knows that you do all have the capability of saving the chat yourselves as well, so that you have all of the links there.
Right, and then Annette just said in the chat we're going to have an open mic later this month, and it's just a purely open mic. It'll probably be around the holidays, where people can just, hopefully concisely talk about what's on their mind, and have a discussion between all of us about all sorts of issues. And Linnell, we'd love to have you and your colleagues from Australia there as well.
And I also put in the chat
Thank
that we are also pursuing a longer term project, which would be a Wikipedia edit-a-thon. Sorry, being tongue tied today. So more information on that can be found on our website as well.
Can I just say how much I appreciate this conversation, and Max from one adoptee, and Linnell, of course, from adoptee to adoptee, just like the heaviness of this and the burden that we have to carry in having these conversations, and that like there's this like sliver of, I mean, it's not a sliver when you hear this conversation like this, it's way bigger than a sliver of the legal complications of all of this. And yet like I'm just sitting with the emotional, like that to me is, if it was a stack of papers, it would be from here to the moon and back. And I just want to say, I think it's such an individual decision, and hearing Claudia and Max, the two of you navigating this as father and mother, son and mother and son. Sorry. I really live for moments like this where we're having deep conversations about this. And Linnell, your pieces as well have just been really, really powerful. So I walk away full and heavy at the same time. So thank you all.
Thanks, Astrid. I really appreciate it. And for those who don't know Astrid, she's with Adoption Mosaic out in Portland. And I would definitely look at what they do. They have some great programs. In fact, one on Saturday, I think on Judaism and adoptees. So that'd be really interesting. Thanks, Astrid. I like your dog back there. Yeah, thanks, Shalise, for putting the link in the chat. We'll save the chat, and as we do always, especially on the ones that we record, we'll have a follow-up email. I've been terrible about getting them out timely, so it may be a couple of weeks, but we'll have the recording, and we'll also have highlights from the chat, including most of the links that were put in the chat. So it'll be sort of a recap, but the recording will be the actual record, and I'll take out that part where I couldn't even get back onto the session. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Greg.
Was that you had to give me control there, Greg. That's what it
Right,
is.
so you can end the meeting if you want. Yeah.
I'm going to make sure I
really thanks so much, everybody, for coming and participating. These are really, as Astrid noted, some really heavy questions. And I mean, I think I'm trained as a lawyer to kind of appear pretty neutral and calm about it. But I'm really glad that Astrid acknowledged that how heavy that is and what we're weighing here as an issue. Thank you.